Voyage to the Country of the Houyhnhnms. Chapter 1. I continued at home with my wife and children about 5 months in a very happy condition, if I could have learned the lesson of knowing when I was well. I left my poor wife big with child, and accepted an advantageous offer made me to be captain of the Adventure, a stout merchantman of 350 tons, for I understood navigation well, and being grown weary of a surgeon's employment in sea, which, however, I could exercise upon occasion, I took a skilful young man of that calling, one Robert Purefoy, into my ship. We set sail from Portsmouth upon the 7th day of August, 1710. On the 14th, we met with a Captain Pocock of Bristol at Tenerife, who was going to the Bay of Campeche to cut logwood. On the 16th, he was parted from us by a storm. I heard since my return that his ship foundered, and none escaped but one cabin boy. He was an honest man and a good sailor, but a little too positive in his own opinions, which was the cause of his destruction, as it hath been of several others. For if he had followed my advice, he might have been safe at home with his family at this time, as well as myself. I had several men died in my ship of calincatures, so that I was forced to get recruits out of Barbados and the Leeward Islands, where I touched by the direction of the merchants who employed me, which I had soon too much cause to repent, for I found afterwards that most of them had been buccaneers. I had 50 hands on board, and my orders were that I should trade with the Indians in the South Sea, and make what discoveries I could. These rogues, whom I picked up, debauched my other men, and they all formed a conspiracy to seize my ship and secure me, which they did one morning, rushing into my cabin and binding me hand and foot, threatening to throw me overboard if I offered to stir. I told them I was a prisoner and would submit. This they made me swear to do, and then they unbound me, only fastening one of my legs with a chain near my bed, and placed a sentry at my door with his piece charged, who was commanded to shoot me dead if I attempted my liberty. They sent down me victuals and drink, and took the government of the ship to themselves. Their design was to turn pirates and plunder the Spaniards, which they could not do till they got more men. But first they resolved to sell the goods in the ship, and then go to Madagascar for recruits, several among them having died since my confinement. They sailed many weeks, and traded with Indians, but I knew not what course they took, being kept a close prisoner in my cabin, and expecting nothing less than to be murdered, as they often threatened me. Upon the 9th day of May, 1711, one James Welsh came down to my cabin, and he said he had orders from the captain to set me ashore. I expostulated with him, but in vain. Neither would he so much as tell me who their new captain was. They forced me into the longboat, letting me put on my best suit of clothes, which was as good as new, and a small bundle of linen, but no arms except my hanger, and they were so civil not to search my pockets, into which I conveyed what money I had, with some other little necessaries. They rowed about a league, and set me down on a strand. I desired them to tell me what country it was. They all swore they knew no more than myself, but said that the captain, as they called him, was resolved, after they had sold the landing, to get rid of me in the first place where they could discover land. They pushed off immediately, advising me to make haste for fear of being overtaken by the tide, and so bade me farewell. In this desolate condition I advanced forward, and soon got upon firm ground, where I sat down on a bank to rest myself, and consider what I had best to do. When I was a little refreshed, I went up into the country, resolving to deliver myself to the first savages I should meet, and purchase my life from them by some bracelets, glass rings, and other toys which sailors usually provide themselves with in those voyages, and whereof I had some about me. The land was divided by long rows of trees, not regularly planted, but naturally growing. There was plenty of grass and several fields of oats. I walked very circumspectly, for fear of being surprised, or suddenly shot with an arrow from behind or on either side. I fell into a beaten road, where I saw many tracks of human feet, and some of cows, but most of them horses. At last I beheld several animals in a field, and one or two of the same kind sitting in trees. Their shape was very singular and deformed, which a little discomposed me, so that I lay down behind a thicket to observe them better. Some of them coming forward near the place where I lay, gave me the opportunity of distinctly marking their form. Their heads and breasts were covered with a thick hair, some frizzled and others lank. They had beards like goats, and a long ridge of hair down their backs and the fore parts of their legs and feet. But the rest of their bodies were bare, so I might see their skins, which were of a brown buff color. They had no tails, nor any hair at all on their buttocks. They sat on the ground, as well as laying down, and often stood on their hind feet. They climbed high trees as nimbly as a squirrel, for they had strong extended claws before and behind, terminating in sharp points and hooked. They would often spring and bound and leap with prodigious agility. The females were not so large as the males. They had long lank hair on their heads, and none on their faces. Their dugs hung between their forefeet, and often reached almost to the ground as they walked. The hair of both sexes was of several colors, brown, red, black, and yellow. Upon the whole, I never beheld in all my travels so disagreeable an animal, nor one against which I so naturally conceived so strongly an antipathy. So that thinking I had seen enough, full of contempt and aversion, I got up and pursued the beaten road, hoping it might direct me to the cabin of some Indian. I had not gotten far when I met one of these creatures full in my way, and coming up directly to me. The ugly monster, when he saw me, distorted several ways every feature of his visage, stared at an object which he had never seen before. Then approaching nearer, lifted up his forepaw, whether out of curiosity or mischief, I could not tell, but I drew my hanger, and gave him a good blow on the flat side of it, for I durst not strike him with the edge, fearing the inhabitants might be provoked against me, if they should come to know that I had killed or maimed any of their cattle. When the beast felt the smart, he drew back and roared so loud that a herd of at least 40 came flocking about me from the next field, howling and making odious faces. But I ran to the body of a tree, and leaning my back against it, kept them off by waving my hanger. Several of the cursed brood, getting hold of the branches behind, leapt up onto the tree, from whence they began to discharge their excrements on my head. However, I escaped pretty well, by sticking close to the stem of the tree, but was almost stifled within the fifth, which fell about me on every side. In the midst of distress, I observed them all to run away on a sudden as fast as they could, at which I ventured to leave the tree, and pursue the road, wondering what it was that could put them into this fright. But looking on my left hand, I saw a horse walking softly in the field, which my persecutors, having sooner discovered, was the cause of their flight. The horse started a little when he came near me, but soon recovering himself, looked full in my face with manifest tokens of wonder. He viewed my hands and feet, walking round me several times. I would have pursued my journey, but he placed himself directly in my way, yet looking with a very mild aspect, never offering the least violence. We stood gazing at each other for some time. At last I took the boldness to reach my hands towards his neck, with a design to stroke it, using the common style and whistle of jockeys when they were going to handle a strange horse. But this animal, seeming to receive my civilities with disdain, shook his head and bent his brows, softly raising up his right forefoot to remove my hand. Then he neighed 3 or 4 times, but in so different a cadence that I almost began to think he was speaking to himself in some language of his own. While he and I were thus employed, another horse came up, who, applying himself to the first in a very formal manner, they gently struck each other's right hoof before, neighing several times by turns, and varying the sound, which seemed to be almost articulate. They went some paces off, as if were to confer together, walking side by side, backwards and forwards, like persons deliberating upon some affair of weight, but often turning their eyes towards me, as it were to watch that I might not escape. I was amazed to see such actions and behavior in brute beasts, and concluded with myself that if the inhabitants of this country were endued with a proportionable degree of reason, they must needs be the wisest people upon earth. This thought gave me so much comfort that I resolved to go forward until I could discover some house or village, or meet with any of the natives, leaving the 2 horses to discourse together as they pleased. But the first, who was a dapple grey, observing me to steal off, neighed after me in such an expressive tone that I fancied myself to understood what he meant, whereupon I turned back and came near him to expect his further commands, but concealing my fear as much as I could, for I began to be in some pain, how this adventure might terminate, and the reader will easily believe I did not much like my present situation. The 2 horses came up close to me, looking with great earnestness upon my face and hands. The grey steed rubbed my hat all around with his right forehoof, and discomposed it so much that I was forced to adjust better by taking it off and setting it again, whereat both and his companion, who was a brown bay, appeared much surprised. The latter felt the lapel of my coat, and finding it to hang loose about me, they both looked with new signs of wonder. He stroked my right hand, seeming to admire its softness and color, but he squeezed it so hard between his hoof and his pastern that I was forced to roar, after which they both touched me with all possible tenderness. They were under great perplexity about my shoes and stockings, which they felt very often, neighing to each other and using various gestures, not unlike those of a philosopher, when he would attempt to solve some new and difficult phenomenon. Upon the whole, the behavior of these animals was so orderly and rational, so acute and judicious, that I at last concluded they must needs be magicians, who had thus metamorphosized themselves upon some design, and seeing a stranger in the way, were resolved to divert themselves with him, or perhaps were really amused at the sight of a man so very different in habit, feature, and complexion from those who might probably live in so remote a climate. Upon the strength of this reasoning, I ventured to address them in the following manner. Gentlemen, if you be conjurers, as I have good cause to believe you, you can understand any language. Therefore I make bold to let your worships know that I am a poor distressed Englishman, driven by his misfortunes upon your coast, and I entreat one of you to let me ride upon his back, as if he were a real horse, to some house or village where I can be relieved. In return of which favor I will make you a present of this knife and bracelet. Taking them out of my pocket, the two creatures stood silent while I spoke, seeming to listen with great attention, and when I had ended, they neighed frequently towards each other, as if they were engaged in serious conversation. I plainly observed that their language expressed the passions very well, and the words might with little pains be resolved into an alphabet more easily than the Chinese. I could frequently distinguish the word Yahoo, which was repeated by each of them several times, and although it was impossible for me to conjecture what they meant, yet while the two horses were busy in conversation, I endeavored to practice the word upon my tongue, and as soon as they were silent, I boldly pronounced Yahoo in a loud voice, imitating, in the same manner, as near I could, to the neighing of a horse, at which they were both visibly surprised. And the grey repeated the same word twice, as if he meant to teach me the right accent, wherein I spoke after him as well as I could, and found myself perceivably to improve every time, though very far from any degree of perfection. Then the bay tried me a second word, much harder to be pronounced, but reducing it to the English orthography, may be spelt thus: Houyhnhnms. I did not succeed in this so well as the former, but after 2 or 3 further trials I had better fortune, and they both appeared amazed by my capacity. After some further discourse, which I then conjectured might relate to me, the two friends took their leaves, with the same compliment of striking each other's hoof, and the grey made me signs that I should walk before him, wherein I thought it prudent to comply, till I could find a better director. When I offered to slacken my pace, he would cry, Hm. I guessed this meaning, and gave him to understand as well as I could that I was weary and not able to walk faster, upon which he would stand a while to let me rest. Chapter 2. Having traveled about 3 miles, we came to a long kind of building made of timber stuck in the ground, and waddled across. The roof was low and covered with straw. I now began to be a little comforted, and took out some toys which travelers usually carry for presents to the savage Indians of America and other parts, in hope the people of the house would be thereby encouraged to receive me kindly. The horse made me a sign to go in first. It was a large room with a smooth clay floor, and a rack and manger extending the whole length on one side. There were 3 nags and 2 mares, not eating, but some of them sitting down upon their hams, which I very much wondered about, but wondered more to see the rest employed in domestic business. These seemed but ordinary cattle. However, this confirmed my first opinion, that a people who could so far civilize brute animals must needs excel in wisdom all the nations of the world. The grey came in just after, and thereby prevented any ill treatment which the others might have given me. He neighed to them several times in a style of authority, and received answers. Beyond this room there were 3 others, reaching the length of the house, to which you passed through 3 doors, opposite each other, in the manner of a vista. We went through the second room towards the third. Here the grey walked in first, beckoning to me to attend. I waited in the second room, and got ready my presents for the master and mistress of the house. There were 2 knives, 3 bracelets of false pearl, a small-looking glass, and a bead necklace. The horse neighed 3 or 4 times, and I waited to hear some answers in a human voice. But I heard no other returns in the same dialect, only 1 or 2 a little shriller than his. I began to think that this horse must belong to some person of great note among them, because there appeared so many ceremony before I could gain attendance. But that a man of quality should be served all by horses was beyond my comprehension. I feared my brain was disturbed by my sufferings and misfortunes. I roused myself and looked about me in the room where I was left alone. This was furnished like the first, only more of an elegant matter. I rubbed my eyes often, and some objects still occurred. I pinched my arms and sides to wake myself fully, hoping I might be in a dream. I then absolutely concluded that all these appearances could be nothing else than necromancy and magic. But I had no time to pursue these reflections, for the grey horse came to the door and made me a sign to follow him into the 3rd room, where I saw a very comely mare, together with a colt and foal, sitting on their haunches upon mats of straw, not unartfully made, and perfectly neat and clean. The mare, soon after my entrance, rose from her mat, and coming up close after having nicely observed my hands and face, gave me a most contemptuous look. Then turning to the horse, I heard the word Yahoo often repeated betwixt them, the meaning of which word I could not then comprehend, although it were the first I had learned to pronounce. But I was soon better informed, to my everlasting mortification, for the horse beckoning to me with his head, and repeating the word Houyhnhnms, as he did upon the road, which I understood was to attend him, led me out into a kind of court, where was another building at some distance from the house. Here we entered, and I saw 3 of the detestable creatures whom I first met after my landing, feeding upon roots and the flesh of some animals, which I afterwards found to be that of asses and dogs, and now and then a cow dead by accident or disease. They were all tied by the neck with strong withes, fastened to a beam. They held their food between their claws of their forefeet, and tore it with their teeth. The master horse ordered a sorrel nag, one of his servants, to untie the largest of these animals and take him into the yard. The beast and I were brought close together, and our countenances diligently compared, both by my master and servant, who thereupon repeated several times the word Yahoo. My horror and astonishment were not to be described when I observed that this abominable animal to be a perfect human figure. The face of it indeed was flat and broad, the nose depressed, the lips large, and the mouth wide. But these differences are common to all savage nations. There the lineaments of the countenance are distorted by the natives suffering their infants to lie grovelling on the earth, or by carrying them on their backs, nuzzling with their face against the mother's shoulders. The forefeet of the Yahoo differed from my hands in nothing else but the length of the nails and coarseness and brownness of the palms, and the hairiness on the backs. There was the same resemblance between our feet with the same differences, which I knew very well, though the horses did not, because of my shoes and stockings. The same in every part of our bodies, except as to the hairiness and discolor, which I have already described. The great difficulty that seemed to stick with the 2 horses was to see the rest of my body so very different from that of a Yahoo, for which I was obliged to my clothes, whereof they had no conception. The sorrel nag offered me a root, which he held, after their manner, as we shall describe in its proper place, between his hoof and pastern. I took it in my hand, and having smelt it, returned it to him again as civilly as I could. He brought out of the Yahoo's kernel a piece of ass's flesh, but it smelt so offensively that I turned from it with loathing. He then threw it to the Yahoo, by whom it was greedily devoured. He afterwards showed me a wisp of hay and fetlock full of oats, but I shook my head to signify that neither of those were food to me. And indeed I now apprehended that I must absolutely starve, if I did not get to some of my own species, for as to those filthy Yahoos, although they were few greater lovers of mankind, at the same time than myself, yet I confess I never saw any sensitive being so detestable on all accounts, and the more I came near to them, the more hateful they grew, while I stayed in that country. This the master horse observed by my behavior, and therefore sent the Yahoo back to his kennel. He then put his forehoof to his mouth, at which I was much surprised, although he did it with ease, and with a motion that appeared perfectly natural, and made other signs to know what I would eat. But I could not return him such an answer as he was able to apprehend, and if he had understood me, I did not see how it was possible to contrive any way for finding myself nourishment. While we were thus engaged, I observed a cow passing by, whereupon I pointed to her and expressed a desire to let me go milk her. This had its effect, for he led me back into the house and ordered a mareservant to open a room where a good store of milk lay in earthen and wooden vessels, after a very orderly and cleanly manner. She gave me a large bowl full, of which I drank very heartily, and found myself well refreshed. About noon I saw coming towards the house a kind of vehicle, drawn by a sledge by 4 Yahoos. There was in it an old steed, who seemed to be of quality. He alighted with his hind feet forward, having by accident got a hurt in his left forefoot. He came to dine with our horse, who received him with great civility. They dined in the best room, and had oats boiled in milk for the second course, which the old horse ate warm, but the rest ate cold. Their mangers were placed circular in the middle of the room, and divided into several partitions, round which they sat on their haunches, upon bosses of straw. In the middle was a large rack with angles answering to every partition of the manger, so that each horse and each mare ate their own hay and their own mash of oats and milk, with much decency and regularity. The behavior of the young colt and foal appeared very modest, and that of the master and mistress extremely cheerful and complacent to their guest. The grey ordered me to stand by him, and much discourse passed between him and his friend by concerning me, as I found by the strangers often looking on me, and the frequent repetition of the word Yahoo. I happened to wear my gloves, which the master grey observing seemed perplexed, discovering signs of wonder when I had done to my forefeet. He put his hoof 3 or 4 times to them, as if he would signify that I would reduce them to their former shape, which I presently did, pulling off both my gloves and putting them into my pocket. This sustained further talk, and I saw the company was pleased with my behavior, whereof I soon found good effects. I was ordered to speak the few words I understood, and while they were at dinner, the master taught me the names for oats, milk, fire, water, and some others, which I could readily pronounce after him, having from my youth a great faculty in learning languages. When dinner was done, the master horse took me aside, and by signs and words made me understand the concern that he was in, that I had nothing to eat. Oats in their tongue were called Houyhnhnms. This word I pronounced 2 or 3 times, for although I had refused them at first, yet upon second thoughts I considered that I could contrive to make them a kind of bread, which might be sufficient with milk to keep me alive, until I could make my escape to some other country, and to creatures of my own species. The horse immediately ordered a white mare servant of his family to bring me a good quantity of oats in a sort of wooden tray. These I heated before the fire as well as I could, and rubbed them till the husks came off, which I made a shift to winnow from the grain. I ground and beat them between 2 stones, then took water and made them into a paste or cake, which I toasted at the fire and ate warm with milk. It was at first a very insipid diet, though common enough in many parts of Europe, but grew tolerable by time, and having been often reduced to hard fare in my life, this was not the first experiment I had made how easily nature is satisfied, and I cannot but observe that I never had 1 hour's sickness while I stayed in this island. 'Tis true, I sometimes made a shift to catch a rabbit or bird by springs made of Yahoo's hairs, and I often gathered wholesome herbs, which I boiled or ate as salads with my bread, and now and then, for a rarity, I made a little butter and drank the whey. I was at first a great loss for salt, but custom soon reconciled the want of it, and I am confident the frequent use of salt among us is an effect of luxury, first introduced only as a provocative to drink, except where it is necessary for preserving of flesh in long voyages, or in places remote from great markets, for we observe no animal to be fond of it but man, and as to myself, when I left this country, it was a great while before I could endure the taste of it in anything that I ate. That is enough to say upon the subject of my diet, wherewith other travellers fill their books, as if the readers were personally concerned whether we fared well or ill. However, it was necessary to mention this matter, lest the world should think it impossible that I could find sustenance for 3 years in such a country, and among such inhabitants. While it grew towards evening, the master horse ordered a place for me to lodge in. It was but 6 yards from the house, and separated from the stable of the Yahoos. Here I got some straw, and covering myself with my own clothes, slept very sound. But I was in a short time better accommodated, as the reader shall know hereafter, when I came to treat more particularly about my way of living. Chapter 3. My principal endeavor was to learn the language, which my master, for so I shall henceforth call him, and his children, and every servant of his house, were desirous to teach me, for they looked upon it as a prodigy that a brute animal should discover such marks of a rational creature. I pointed to everything and inquired the name of it, which I wrote down in my journal book when I was alone, and corrected my bad accent by desiring those of the family to pronounce it often. In this employment, a sorrel nag, one of the underservants, was ready to assist me. In speaking, they pronounce through the nose and throat, and their language approaches nearest to the High Dutch or German of any I know in Europe, but is much more graceful and significant. The Emperor Charles V made almost the same observation when he said that if he were to speak to his horse, it should be in High Dutch. The curiosity and impatience of my master were so great that he spent many hours of his leisure to instruct me. He was convinced, as he afterwards told me, that I must be a Yahoo, but my teachableness, civility, and cleanliness astonished him, which were qualities altogether so opposite to those animals. He was most perplexed by my clothes, reasoning sometimes with himself whether they were a part of my body, for I never pulled them off till the family were asleep, and got them on before they waked in the morning. My master was eager to learn from whence I came, how I acquired these appearances of reason which I discovered in all my actions, and to know my story from my own mouth, which he hoped should soon do by the great proficiency I made in learning and pronouncing their words and sentences. To help my memory, I formed all I learned to the English alphabet, and writ the words down with the translations. At last, at some time, I ventured to do so. Ventured to do in my master's presence. It cost me much trouble to explain to him what I was doing, for the inhabitants have not the least idea of books or literature. In about 10 weeks' time, I was able to understand most of his questions, and in 3 months could give him some tolerable answers. He was extremely curious to know from what part of the country I came, and how I was taught to imitate a rational creature, because the Yahoos, whom he saw I exactly resembled in my head, hands, and face, were only visible, with some appearance of cunning and the strongest disposition to mischief, were observed to be the most unteachable of all brutes. I answered that I came over the sea from a far place, with many others of my own kind in a great hollow vessel made of bodies of trees, that my companions forced me to land on this coast and left me to shift for myself. It was with some difficulty and by the help of many signs that I brought him to understand me. He replied that I must needs be mistaken, or that I said the thing which was not, for they have no words in their language to express lying or falsehood. He knew it was impossible that there could be a country beyond the sea, or that a parcel of brutes could move a wooden vessel, or that they pleased upon water. He was sure no alive could make such a vessel, nor would trust Yahoos to manage it. The word in their tongue signifies a horse, and in its etymology, the perfection of nature. I told my master that I was at a loss for expression, but would improve as fast as I could, and hoped in short time I should be able to tell him wonders. He was pleased to direct his own mare, his colt and foal, and the servants of the family to take all opportunities instructing me, and every day for 2 or 3 hours he was at the same pains himself. Several horses and mares of quality in the neighborhood came often to our house upon the report spread of a wonderful Yahoo that could speak like a Houyhnhnm, and seemed in his words and actions to discover some glimmerings of reason. These delighted to converse with me. They put many questions and received such answers as I was able to return. By all these advantages, I made so great a progress that in 5 months from my arrival, I understood whatever was spoke and could express myself tolerably well. The Houyhnhnms, who came to visit my master out of a design of seeing and talking with me, could hardly believe me to be a right Yahoo, because my body had a different covering from others of my kind. They were astonished to observe me without the usual hair or skin, except on my head, face, and hands, but discovered that secret to my master upon an accident which happened about a fortnight before. I've already told the reader that every night when the family had gone to bed, it was my custom to strip and cover myself with my clothes. It happened one morning, early, that my master sent for me by the sorrel nag, who was his valet. When he came, I was fast asleep, my clothes fallen off on one side, and my shirt above my waist. I awakened to the noise he made, and observed him to deliver his message in some disorder, after which he went to my master, and in a great fright gave him a very confused account of what he had seen. This I presently discovered, for going as soon as I was dressed to pay my attendance upon his honor, he asked me the meaning of what his servants had reported, that I was not the same thing when I slept as I appeared to be as other times, that his valet assured him some part of me was white, some yellow, at least not so white, and some brown. I had hitherto concealed the secret of my dress in order to distinguish myself as much as possible from that cursed race of Yahoos, but now I found it in vain to do so any longer. Besides, I considered that my clothes and shoes would soon wear out, which already were in a declining condition, and must be supplied by some other contrivance from the hides of the Yahoos or other brutes, whereby the whole secret would be known. I therefore told my master that in the country from whence I came, those of my kind always covered their bodies with the hairs of certain animals, prepared by art as well for decency as to avoid the inclemencies of air, both hot and cold, of which as to my own person I would give him immediate conviction, as if he pleased to command me, only desiring his excuse if I did not expose those parts that nature taught us to conceal. He said my discourse was all very strange, but especially the last part, for he could not understand why nature should teach us to conceal what nature had given, that neither himself nor his family were ashamed of any parts of their bodies, but however I might do as I pleased. Whereupon I first unbuttoned my coat and pulled it off. I did the same with my waistcoat. I drew off my shoes, stockings, and breeches. I let my shirt down to my waist, and drew up the bottom, fastening it to a girdle about my middle to hide my nakedness. My master observed the whole performance with great signs of curiosity and admiration. He took up all my clothes in his pastern, one piece after another, and examined them diligently. He then stroked my body very gently, and looked round me several times, after which he said it was plain that I must be a perfect Yahoo, but that I differed very much from the rest of my species, in the softness and whiteness and smoothness of my skin, my want of hair in several parts of my body, the shape and shortness of my claws behind and before, and my affection of walking continually on my two hinder feet. He desired to see no more, and gave me leave to put on my clothes again, for I was shuddering with cold. I expressed my uneasiness at his giving me so often the application of Yahoo, an odorous animal for which I had so utter a hatred and contempt. I begged he would forbear applying the word to me, and take the same order in his family, and among his friends whom he suffered to see me. I requested likewise that the secret of my having a false covering to my body might be known to none but himself, at least as long as my present clothing should last. For as to what the sorrel nag his valet has observed, his honor might command him to conceal it. All this my master was very graciously consented to, and thus the secret was kept till my clothes began to wear out, which I was forced to supply by several contrivances that shall hereafter be mentioned. In the meantime, he desired I would go on with my utmost diligence to learn their language, because he was more astonished at my capacity for speech and reason than at the figure of my body, whether it were covered or no, adding that he waited with some impatience to hear the wonders which I promised to tell him. From thenceforward he doubled the pains he had been at to instruct me. He brought me into all company, and made them treat me with civility, because, as he told them privately, this would put me into good humor, and make me more diverting. Every day when I waited upon him, besides the trouble, that's funny. Every day when I waited upon him, besides the trouble he was at in teaching, he would ask me several questions concerning myself, which I answered as well as I could, and by those means he had already recovered some general ideas, though very imperfect. It would be tedious to relate the several steps by which I advanced to a more regular conversation, but the first account I give of myself in any order and length was to this purpose: that I came from a very far country, and I already attempted to tell him, with about 50 more of my own species, that we travelled upon the seas in a great hollow vessel made of wood, and larger than his honour's house. I described the ship to him in the best terms I could, and explained by the help of my handkerchief displayed how it was driven forward by the wind, that upon a quarrel among us I was set upon the shore of this coast, where I walked forward without knowing whither, till he delivered from me the persecution of those execrable Yahoos. He asked me who made the ship, and how it was possible that the Houyhnhnms of my country would leave it to the management of brutes. My answer was that I durst proceed no further in my relation, unless he would give me his word and honour that he would not be offended, and then I would tell him the wonders I had so often promised. He agreed, and I went on by assuring him that the ship was made by the creatures like myself, who in all the countries I have travelled, as well as in my own, were the only governing rational animals, and that upon my arrival hither I was much astonished to see the Houyhnhnms act like rational beings, as he or his friends could be finding some marks of reason in a creature he was pleased to call a Yahoo, to which I owned my resemblance in every part, but could not account for the degenerate and brutal nature. I said further that if good fortune ever restored me to my native country, to relate towards my hither, as I resolved to do, everybody would believe that I said the thing which was not, that I invented the story out of my own head, and with all possible respect to himself, his family, and friends, and under the promise of not being offended, our countrymen would think it probable that a Houyhnhnm should be a presiding creature of a nation, and a Yahoo the brute. Chapter 4. My master heard me with great appearances of uneasiness in his countenance, because doubting or not believing are so little known in this country, that the inhabitants cannot tell how to behave themselves under such circumstances. And I remember in frequent discourses with my master concerning the nature of manhood in other parts of the world, having occasion to talk of lying and false representation, it was with much difficulty that he comprehended what I meant, although he had otherwise a most accurate judgment. For he argued thus, that the use of speech was to make us understand one another, and to receive information of facts. Now if it was one said the thing which was not, these ends were defeated, because I could not properly be said to understand him. I am so far from receiving information that he leaves me worse than in ignorance. For I am led to believe a thing black when it is white, and short when it is long. And these were all notions he had concerning that faculty of lying, so perfectly well understood among human creatures. To return from this digression, when I asserted that the Yahoos were the only governing animals in my country, which my master said was altogether past his conception, he desired to know whether we had Houyhnhnms among us, and what was their employment. I told him we had great numbers, that in summer they grazed in the fields, and in winter we kept them in houses with hay and oats, where Yahoo servants were employed to rub their skins smooth, comb their manes, pick their feet, and serve them with food, and make their beds. I understand you well, said my master. It is now very plain, from all you have spoken, that whether share of reason the Yahoos pretend to, the Houyhnhnms of your masters, I heartily wish our Yahoos would be so tractable. I begged his honour would please to excuse me from proceeding any further, because I was very certain that the account he expected from me would be highly displeasing. But he insisted in commanding me to let him know the best and the worst. I told him he should be obeyed. I owned that the Houyhnhnms among us, whom we called horses, were the most generous and comely animals we had, that they excelled in strength and swiftness, and when they belonged to persons of quality, employed in travelling, racing, or drawing chariots, they were treated with much kindness and care, till they fell to disease or became foundered in the feet, and then they were sold, and used in all kind of drudgery till they died, after which their skins were stripped and sold for what they were worth, and their bodies left to be devoured by dogs and birds of prey. But the common race of horses had not so good fortune, being kept by farmers and carriers, and other mean people, who put them to great labour and fed them worse. I described, as well as I could, our way of riding, the shape and use of a bridle, a saddle, a spur, and a whip, of harnesses and wheels. I added that we fastened plates of a certain hard substance called iron to the bottom of their feet to preserve their hoofs from being broken by the stony ways on which we traveled. My master, after some expressions of great indignation, wondered how we dared to venture upon a Houyhnhnms back, for he was sure that the weakest servant in his house would be able to shake off the strongest Yahoo, or by laying down and rolling on his back, squeeze the brute to death. I answered that our horses were trained up from 3 or 4 years old to the several uses we intended them for, that if any of them proved intolerably vicious, they were employed for carriages, that they were severely beaten while they were young for any mischievous tricks, that the males designated for common use of riding or draught were generally castrated about 2 years after their birth, to take down their spirits and make them more tame and gentle, that they were indeed sensible of rewards and punishments, but his honor would please to consider that they had not the least tincture of reason any more than the Yahoos of this country. It put me to the pains of many circumlocutions to give my master the right idea of what I spoke, for their language doth not abound in variety of words, because their wants and passions are fewer than among us. But it is impossible to represent this noble resentment at our savage treatment of the Houyhnhnm race, particularly after I had explained the manner and use of castrating horses among us, to hinder them from propagating their kind, and to render them more servile. He said if it were possible there could be any country where Yahoos alone were endued with reason. That certainly must be the governing animal, because the reason will, in time, always prevail against brutal strength. But considering the frame of our bodies, and especially of mine, he thought no creature of equal bulk was so ill contrived for employing that reason in the common offices of life, whereupon he desired to know whether those among whom I lived resembled me or the Yahoos of his country. I assured him that I was very well shaped, as most of my age, but the younger and the females were much more soft and tender, the skins of the latter generally as white as milk. He said I differed indeed from the other Yahoos, being much more cleanly, and not altogether so deformed. But in point of real advantage he thought I differed for the worse, that my nails were of no use to either force or hind feet, as to my forefeet. He could not properly call them by that name, for he never observed me to walk upon them, that they were too soft to bear the ground. But I generally went with them uncovered, neither was the covering I sometimes wore on them of the same shape or so strong that on my feet behind, that I could not walk with any security, for if either of my hinder feet slipped, I must inevitably fall. He then began to find fault with other parts of my body, the flatness of my face, the prominence of my nose, my eyes planted directly in front, so that I could not look on either side without turning my head, that I was not able to feed myself without lifting one of my forefeet to my mouth, and therefore nature had placed those joints to answer the necessity. He knew not what could be the use of these several clefts and divisions in my feet behind, that these were too soft to bear the hardness and sharpness of stones without a covering made from the skin of some other brute, that my whole body wanted a fence against heat and cold, which I was forced to put on and off every day with tediousness and trouble, and lastly, that he observed every animal in this country naturally to abhor the Yahoos, whom the weaker avoided and the stronger drove from them. So that supposing us to have the gift of reason, he could not see how it were possible to cure that natural antipathy which every creature discovered against us, nor consequently how we could tame and render them serviceable. However, he would, as he said, debate the matter no further, because he was more desirous to know my own story, the country where I was born, and several actions and events of my life before I came hither. I assured him how extremely desirous I was that he should be satisfied in every point, but I doubted much whether it would be possible for me to explain myself on several subjects whereof his honor could have no conception, because I saw nothing in his country to which I could resemble him. Now, however, I would do my best and strive to express myself by similarities, humbly desiring his assistance when I wanted proper words, which he was pleased to promise me. I said my birth was of honest parents in an island called England, which was remote from this country, as many days' journey as the strongest of his honour's servants could travel in the annual course of the sun, that I was bred a surgeon, whose trade it is to care for wounds and hurts in the body, got by accident or violence, that my country was governed by a female man, whom we called a queen, that I left it to get riches, whereby I might maintain myself and family when I should return, that in my last voyage I was commander of the ship, and had about 50 Yahoos under me, many of which died at sea, and I was forced to supply them by others picked out from several nations, that our ship was twice in danger of being sunk, the first time by a great storm, and the second by striking against a rock. Here my master interposed, and asked me how I could persuade strangers out of different countries to venture with me, after the losses I sustained, and the hazards I had run. I said they were fellows of desperate fortunes, forced to fly from the places of their birth on account of their poverty or their crimes. Some were undone by lawsuits, others spent all they had in drinking and gaming. Others fled for treason, many for murder, theft, poisoning, robbery, perjury, forgery, coining false money, for flying from their colors, or deserting to the enemy, and most of them had broken prison. None of them durst return to their native countries for fear of being hanged, or of starving in a jail, and therefore were under the necessity of seeking a livelihood in other places. During this discourse, my master was pleased to interrupt me several times. I had made use of many circumlocutions in describing to him the nature of several crimes, for which most of our crew had been forced to fly their country. This labor took up several days' conversation before he was able to comprehend me. He was wholly at a loss to know what could be the use or necessity of practicing those vices. To clear up what I endeavored to give him some ideas of the desire of power and riches, of the terrible effects of lust, intemperance, malice, and envy. All this I was forced to define and describe by putting of cases and making of suppositions, after which, like one whose imagination was struck with something never seen or heard of before, he would lift up his eyes with amazement and indignation. Power, government, war, law, punishment, and 1,000 other things had no terms wherein that language could express them, which made the difficulty almost insuperable to give my master any conception of what I meant. But being of an excellent understanding, much improved by contemplation and converse, he at last arrived at a competent knowledge of what human nature in our parts of the world is capable to perform, and desired I would give him some particular account of that land which we call Europe, but especially of my own country. Chapter 5. The reader may please to observe that the following extract of many conversations I had with my master contains a summary of the most material points which were discoursed at several times for the above 2 years. His Honour, after desiring fuller satisfaction as I further improved in the Houyhnhnms tongue, I laid before him, as well as I could, the whole state of Europe. I discoursed of trade and manufactures, of arts and sciences, and of the answers I gave to all those questions he made, as they arose upon several subjects, were a fund of conversation not to be exhausted. But I shall here only set down the substance of what passed between us concerning my own country, reducing it into the order, as well as I can, without any regard to time or other circumstances, where I strictly adhere to truth. My only concern is that I shall hardly be able to do justice to my master's arguments and expressions, which must needs suffer by my want of capacity, as well as by translation into our barbarous English. In obedience, therefore, to his Honour's commands, I related to him the revolution under the Prince of Orange, the long war which France entered into by the said prince, and renewed by his successor, the present queen, wherein the greatest powers of Christendom were engaged, and which still continued. I computed, at his request, that about 1,000,000 of Yahoos might have been killed in the whole progress of it, and perhaps 100 or more cities taken, and thrice as many ships burnt or sunk. He asked me what were the usual causes or motives that made one country go to war with another. I answered they were innumerable, but I should only mention a few of the chief. Sometimes the ambition of princes, who never think they have land or people enough to govern. Sometimes the corruption of ministers, who engage their master in a war in order to stifle or divert the clamor of the subjects against their evil administration. Difference in opinions hath cost many millions their lives. For instance, whether flesh be bread, or bread be flesh, whether the juice of a certain berry be blood or wine, whether whistling be a vice or a virtue, whether it be better to kiss a post or throw it into the fire. What is the best color for a coat, whether black, white, red, or gray, and whether it should be long or short, narrow or wide, dirty or clean, and many more. Neither are any wars so furious and bloody, or of so long continuance, that these occasioned by difference in opinion, especially if it be in things indifferent. Sometimes the quarrel between two princes is to decide which of them shall dispossess a third of his dominions, whether neither of them pretend to any right. Sometimes one prince quarrelleth with another, for fear the other shall quarrel with him. Sometimes a war is entered upon because the enemy is too strong, and sometimes because he is too weak. Sometimes our neighbors want the things which we have, or have the things which we want, and we both fight, till they take ours or give us theirs. It is a very justifiable cause of war to invade a country after the people have been wasted by famine, destroyed by pestilence, or embroiled by factions amongst themselves. It is justifiable to enter into war against our nearest ally, when one of his towns lies convenient for us, or territory of land, and would render our dominions round and complete. If a prince sends forth into a nation where the people are poor and ignorant, he may lawfully put half of them to death, and make slaves of the rest, in order to civilize and reduce them from their barbarous way of living. It is a very kingly, honorable, and frequent practice, when one prince does the assistance of another to secure him against an invasion, that the assistance, when he hath driven out the invader, should seize on the dominions himself, and kill, imprison, or banish the prince he came to relieve. Alliance by blood or marriage is a frequent cause of war between princes, and the nearer the kindred is, the greater is their disposition to quarrel. Poor nations are hungry, and rich nations are proud, and pride and hunger will ever be at variance. For these reasons, the trade of a soldier is held the most honorable of all others, because a soldier is a Yahoo hired to kill in cold blood as many of his own species who have neither offended him as possibly he can. There is likewise a kind of beggarly princes in Europe not able to make war by themselves, who hire out their troops to richer nations for so much a day to each man, of which they keep 3/4 to themselves, and it is the best part of their maintenance. Such are those in Germany and other northern parts of Europe. For what you have told me, said my master, upon the subject of war, does indeed discover most admirably the effects of the reason you pretend to. However, it is happy that the shame is greater than the danger, and that the nature hath left you utterly incapable of doing much mischief. For your mouths laying flat upon your faces can hardly bite each other to any purpose, unless by consent. Then as to the claws upon your feet, before and behind, they are so short and tender that one of our Yahoos would drive a dozen of youths before him. And therefore, in recounting the numbers of those who have been killed in battle, I cannot but think you have said the thing which is not. I could not forbear shaking my head and smiling at his ignorance, and being no stranger to the art of war, I gave him a description of cannons, culverins, muskets, carbines, pistols, bullets, powder, swords, bayonets, battles, sieges, retreats, attacks, undermines, countermines, bombardments, sea fights, ships sunk with 1,000 men, 20,000 killed on each side, dying groans, limbs flying in the air, smoke, noise, confusion, trampling to death under horses' feet, flight, pursuit, victory, fields strewed with carcasses left for food to dogs and wolves and birds of prey, plundering, stripping, ravaging, burning, and destroying. And to set forth the valor of my own dear country, I assured him that I had seen them blow up 100 enemies at once in a siege, as many in a ship, and beheld the dead bodies come down in pieces from the clouds, to the great diversion of the spectators. I was going on to more particulars when my master commanded me to silence. He said whoever understood the nature of Yahoos might easily believe it possible for so vile an animal to be capable of every action I had named, if their strength and cunning quelled by their malice. But as my discourse had increased his abhorrence of those whole species, so he found it gave him a disturbance in his mind, to which he was wholly a stranger before. He thought his ears, being used to such abominable words, might by degrees admit them with less detestation, that although he hated the Yahoos of his country, yet he no more blamed them for their odious qualities than he did a guenon, or a bird of prey, for its cruelty, or a sharp stone for cutting his hoof. But when a creature pretending to reason could be capable of such enormities, he dreaded lest the corruption of that faculty must be worse than the brutality itself. He seemed therefore confident that instead of reason we were only possessed of some quality fitted to increase our natural vices, as the reflection from a troubled stream returns the image of an ill-shapen body, not only larger, but more distorted. He added that he had heard too much upon the subject of war, both in this and some former discourses. There was another point which a little perplexed him. At present, I had informed him that some of our crew left their country on account of being ruined by law. That I had already explained the meaning of the word, but he was at a loss how it should come to pass, that the law, which was intended for every man's preservation, should be any man's ruin. Therefore he desired to be further satisfied what I meant by law, and dispensers thereof, according to the present practice in my own country, because he thought nature and reason were sufficient guides for a reasonable animal, as we pretend to be, in showing us to what we ought to do and what to avoid. I assured his honour that law was a science wherein I had not much conversed, further than by employing advocates in vain upon some injustices that had been done in me. However, I would give him all the satisfaction I was able. I said there was a society of men among us, bred up from their youth in the art of providing, by words, multiplied for the purpose, that white is black and black is white, according as they are paid. To this society all the rest of the people are slaves. For example, if my neighbor hath a mind to my cow, he hires a lawyer to prove that he ought to have my cow from me. I must then hire another to defend my right, it being against all rules of law that any man should be allowed to speak for himself. Now in this case I who am the right owner lie under the great disadvantages. What? Now in this case I who am the right owner lie upon the two great disadvantages. First, my lawyer, being practiced almost from his cradle in defending falsehood, is quite out of his element when he would be an advocate for justice, which as an office unnatural, he always attempts with ill will. The second disadvantage is that my lawyer must proceed with great caution, or else he will be reprimanded by the judges and abhorred by his brethren as one that would lessen the practice of the law. And therefore I have but two methods of preserving my cow. The first is to gain over my adversary's lawyer with a double fee, who will then betray his client by insinuating that he hath justice on his side. The second way is for my lawyer to make my cause appear as unjust as he can by allowing the cow to belong to my adversary. And this, if it be skilfully done, will certainly bespeak the favour of the bench. Now, your honour is to know that these judges are persons appointed to decide all controversies of property, as well as the trial of criminals, and picked out from the most dexterous lawyers, who are grown old or lazy, and having been biased all their lives against truth and equity, are under such a fatal necessity of favouring fraud, perjury, and oppression, that I have known several of them to refuse a large bribe from the side where justice lay, rather than injure the faculty by doing anything unbecoming their nature or their office. It is a maxim among these lawyers that whatever hath been done before may legally be done again, and therefore they take special care to record all the decisions formerly made against common justice and the general reason of mankind. These, under the name of precedents, may produce as authorities to justify the most inquisitive opinions, and the judges never fail of directing accordingly. In pleading, they studiously avoid entering into their merits of the cause, but are loud, violent, and tedious in dwelling upon all circumstances which are not to purpose. For instance, in the case already mentioned, they never desire to know what claim or title my adversary hath to my cow, but whether the said cow were red or black, or her horns long or short, whether the field I graze her be round or square, whether she was milked at home or abroad, what diseases she is subject to, and the like, after which they consult precedents, adjourn to the cause from time to time, and in 10, 20, or 30 years come to an issue. It is likewise to be observed that this society hath a particular cant and jargon of their own, that no other mortal man can understand, that wherein all their laws are written, which they take special care to multiply, whereby they have wholly confounded the very existence of truth and falsehood, of right and wrong, so that it will take 30 years to decide whether the field left me by my ancestors for 6 generations belongs to me, or to a stranger 300 miles off. In the trial of persons accounted for crimes against the state, the method is much more short and commendable. The judge first sends to sound the disposition of those in power, after which he can easily hang or save the criminal, strictly preserving all due forms of law. Here my master, interposing, said it would be a pity that creatures endowed with such prodigious abilities of mind as these lawyers, by the description I gave of them, must certainly be, were not rather encouraged, to be instructors of others in wisdom and knowledge. In answer to which I assured his honor that in all points of their own trade they were the most ignorant and stupid generation among us, most despicable in common conversation, avowed enemies to all knowledge and learning, and equally disposed to prevent the general reason of mankind in every other subject of discourse, as in that of their own profession. Chapter 6. My master was yet wholly at a loss to understand what motives could incite this race of lawyers to perplex, disquiet, and weary themselves, and engage in confederacy of injustice, merely for the sake of injuring their fellow animals. Neither could he comprehend what I meant in saying, they did it for hire, whereupon I was at much pains to describe him the use of money, the materials it was made of, and the value of the metals. That when a Yahoo got a great store of this precious substance, he was able to purchase whatever he had mind to, the finest clothing, the noblest horses, great tracts of land, and the most costly meats and drinks, and have his choice of the most beautiful females. Therefore, since money alone was able to perform all these feats, our Yahoos thought they could never have enough of it to spend or save, as they found themselves inclined from their natural bent either to profusion or avarice. That the rich man enjoyed the fruit of the poor man's labor, that the latter were 1,000 to 1 in proportion to the former, that the bulk of our people were forced to live miserably by laboring every day for small wages to make a few live plentifully. I enlarged myself much on these and many other particulars to the same purpose, but his honor was still too seek, for he went upon a supposition that all animals had a title to their share in the productions of the earth, and especially those who presided over the rest. Therefore he desired I would let him know what these costly meats were, and how any of us supposed to want them. Whereupon I enumerated as many shorts as came into my head, with the various methods of dressing them, which could not be done without sending vessels by sea to every part of the world, as well for liquors to drink, as for sauces and innumerable other conveniences. I assured him that this whole globe of earth must be at least 3 times gone round before one of our better female Yahoos could get her breakfast or a cup to put it in. He said that must needs be a miserable country, which cannot furnish food for its own inhabitants, but which he chiefly wondered at, was how vast tracts of ground, as I described, should be wholly without fresh water, and the people put to the necessity of sending over the sea for drink. I replied that England, the dear place of my nativity, was computed to produce 3 times the quantity of food, more than its inhabitants were able to consume, as well liquors extracted from grain or pressed out of fruit of certain trees were made excellent drink, and some proportion in every other convenience of life. But in order to feed the luxury and intemperance of the males and the vanity of the females, we sent away the greatest part of our necessary things to other countries, from whence in return we brought the materials of diseases, follies, and vice to spend among ourselves. Hence it follows of necessity that vast numbers of our people are compelled to seek their livelihood by begging, robbing, stealing, cheating, forswearing, flattering, suborning, forging, gaming, lying, fawning, hectoring, voting, scribbling, stargazing, poisoning, canting, libeling, freethinking, and the like occupants, every one of which terms I was at much pains to make him understand. That wine was not imported among us from foreign countries to supply the want of water or other drinks, but because it was a sort of liquid which made us merry by putting us out of our senses, diverted all melancholy thoughts, begat wild extravagant imaginations in the brain, raised our hopes and banished our fears, suspended every office of reason for a time, and deprived us for the use of our limbs, till we fell into profound sleep, although it must be confessed that we always awakened sick and dispirited, and that the use of this liquor fills us with diseases, which makes our lives uncomfortable and short. But besides all this, the bulk of our people supported themselves by furnishing the necessities or conveniences of life to the rich, and to each other. For instance, when I am at home and dressed as I ought to be, I carry on my body the workmanship of 100 tradesmen. The building and furniture of my house employ many more, and 5 times the number to adorn my wife. I was going on to tell him of another sort of people, who get their livelihood by attending the sick, having upon some occasions informed his honor that many of my crew had died of diseases. But here was the utmost difficulty that I brought him to apprehend what I meant. He could easily conceive that a Houyhnhnm grew weak and heavy a few days before his death, or by some accident might hurt a limb, but that nature, who works all things to perfection, should suffer any pains to breed in other bodies, he thought impossible, and desired to know the reason of so uncountable an evil. I told him we fed on 1,000 things, which operated contrary to each other, that we ate when we were not hungry, and drank without the provocation of thirst, that we sat whole nights drinking strong liquors without eating a bit, which disposed us to sloth, inflamed our bodies, and precipitated our prevented digestion, that prostitute female yahoos acquired a certain malady, which bred rottenness in the bones of those who fell into their embraces, that this and many other diseases were propagated from father to son, so that great numbers come into the world with complicated maladies upon them, that it would be endless to give him a catalogue of all diseases incident to human bodies, for they could not be fewer than 500 or 600, spread over every limb and joint, in short, every part, external and intestine, having diseases appropriated to them. To remedy which there was a sort of people bred among us the profession of pretense of curing the sick, and because I had some skill in the faculty, I would be in gratitude to his honor, let him know the whole mystery and method by which they proceed. Their fundamental is that all diseases arise from liplation, from whence they conclude that a great evacuation of the body is necessary. Their next business is from herbs, minerals, gums, oils, shells, salts, juices, seaweed, excrements, barks of trees, serpents, toads, frogs, spiders, dead man's flesh and bones, birds, beasts, and fishes, to form a composition for smell and taste most abominable, nauseous, and detestable they can possibly contrive, which the stomach immediately rejects with loathing. But besides real diseases, we are subject to many that are only imaginary, for which the physicians have invented imaginary cures. These have their several names, and so have the drugs that are proper for them. And with these our female yahoos are always infested. One great excellency in this tribe is their skill at prognostics. One great excellency in this tribe is their skill at prognostics, wherein they seldom fail. Their predictions in real diseases, which they rise to any degree of malignity, generally portending death, which is always in their power, when recovery is not, and therefore, if any expected signs of amendment, after they have pronounced their sentence, rather than be accused as false prophets, they know how to approve their sagacity to the world by a seasonable dose. They are likewise of special use to husbands and wives who are grown weary of their mates, to eldest sons, to great ministers of state, and often to princes. I had formerly upon occasion discoursed with my master upon the nature of government in general, and particularly of our own excellent constitution, deservedly the wonder and envy of the whole world. But having here accidentally mentioned a minister of state, he commended me some time after to inform him what species of Yahoo I particularly meant by that appellation. I first told him that a first chief minister of state, who was a person I intended to describe, was a creature wholly exempt from joy and grief, love and hatred, pity and anger, at least made use of no other passions but a violent desire of wealth, power, and titles, that he applies his words to all uses, except to the indiction of his mind, that he never tells the truth, he never tells the truth, but with an intent that you should take it for a lie, but with a design that you should take it for the truth. That those he speaks worth of behind their backs are in the surest way of preferment, and whether he begins to praise you to others or to yourself, you are from that day forlorn. The worst mark you can receive is a promise, especially when it is confirmed with an oath, after which every wise man retires and gives over all hopes. There are three methods by which a man may rise to the chief minister. The first is by knowing how with prudence to dispose of a wife, a daughter, or a sister. The second by betraying or undermining his predecessor. The third by furious zeal in public assemblies against the corruptions of the court. But a wise prince would rather choose to employ those who practice the last of these methods, because such zealots prove always the most obsequious and subservient to the will and passions of their master, that these ministers, having all employments at their disposal, preserve themselves in power by bribing the majority of the Senate or Great Council, and at last by expedient called an act of indemnity, whereof I describe the nature to him. They secure themselves from altar reckonings and retire from the public, laden with the spoils of the nation. The palace of a chief minister is a seminary to breed up others in his own trade, the pages, lackeys, and porter, by imitating their master, become ministers of state in their several districts, and learn to excel in the three principal ingredients of insolence, lying, and bribery. Accordingly, they have a subaltern court paid to them by persons of the best rank, and sometimes by the force of dexterity and impudence among those several graduations, to be successors to their lord. He is usually governed by a decayed wench or favorite footman, who are the tunnels through which all graces are conveyed, and may properly be called, in the last resort, the governors of the kingdom. One day in discourse, my master, having heard me mention the nobility of my country, was pleased to make me compliant, which I could not pretend to deserve. That he was sure I must have been born of some noble family, because I far exceeded in shape, color, and cleanliness all the other Yahoos of this nation, although I seemed to fail in strength and agility, which must be imputed into my different way of living from those other brutes. And besides, I was not only endowed with the faculty of speech, but likewise with some rudiments of reason, to a degree that with all his acquaintance I passed for prodigy. He made me observe that among the Houyhnhnms, that the white, the sorrel, and the iron grey were not so exactly shaped as the bay, the dapple grey, and the black, nor born with equal talents of the mind or capacity to improve them, and therefore continued always in the condition of servants, without ever aspiring to match out of their own race, which in that country would be reckoned monstrous and unnatural. I made his honour my most humble acknowledgments for the good opinion he was pleased to conceive of me, but assured him that at the same time that my birth was of the lower sort, having been born of plain and honest parents, who were just able to give me a tolerable education, that nobility among us were altogether a different thing from the idea he had of it, that our young noblemen were bred from their children, that our young noblemen are bred from their children in idleness and luxury, that when their fortunes are almost ruined, they marry some women of a mean birth, disagreeable person, an unsound constitution, merely for the sake of money, whom they hate and despise, that the productions of such marriages are generally scrofulous, rickety, or deformed children, by which means the family seldom continues above 3 generations, that a weak diseased body, a menagerie countenance, and shallow complexion are the true marks of a noble blood, and the healthy, robust appearance is so disgraceful in a man of quality, that the world concludes his real father to have been a groom or a coachman. The imperfections of his mind run parallel with those of his body, being a composition of spleen, dullness, ignorance, caprice, sensuality, and pride. Without the consent of this illustrious body, no law can be enacted, repealed, or altered, and these have the decision of all our possessions without appeal.